Hey, Blockheads, welcome back. We are talking about a very exciting topic today. I'm also flaunting one of the kittens I'm fostering. That may attract views or it may detract views. If you know cats, you know a lot of them are quite evil and adorable. It's a very difficult balance to manage. But today we wanted to talk about something that's a pretty hot topic right now, which is Amazon's Rings of Power. Now there's a lot, before we get started, there's a lot that we can complain about, just to be open, in terms of the marketing, in terms of the drama surrounding Amazon trying to produce such a large show with such a important background, important world it's pulling from. But we're going to try and do our best. We may fail, but we're going to try and do our best to talk about some things that the show is actually doing right. Because one of the most unfortunate truths about these shows, any creative endeavor that's backed by a big company, is that it's a creative endeavor. And there are people behind it who care about the project and want to make something, we hope, quite beautiful. And so respectfully, we want to talk about some writing principles we can actually learn from Rings of Power, as well as things that we enjoy about the show. So one thing I want to get started in terms of conversation, and then I can open it up to the rest of the group, is I am greatly enjoying talking about like the first episode in particular, but the two that have since come out. The push to try to maintain Tolkien's tonal approach to fantasy. Like, it didn't feel like they were trying to remake Game of Thrones. Didn't feel like they were trying to adhere to a 2022 format of what a fantasy show should look like, but rather is trying to follow the writing and the principles, the moralistic principles Tolkien tended to put behind all of his work. And I like that they stuck with that. I don't know what you guys think.
I was just going to say, to that point, there was something really familiar and endearing to me at the start of episode 1 when we began with a long stretch of exposition, right? Really did kind of flash me back to Fellowship of the Rings, which begins with a similar sort of narrative voiceover at the beginning, telling us long stretches of history that led us to where we are now. Regardless of any feeling past that point of episode 1, those kind of first moments that had this kind of like storytelling, this explicit storytelling element to it, with backdrops of kind of like grandiose scale, felt very familiar, and I would say even to a degree felt very cozy, as someone who really loves the original Peter Jackson trilogy. So I liked that stretch quite a bit. It felt very in genre to me.
For me, I really liked the way that they kind of introduced the backstory of the elves as a whole, because you're going into this trying to tell the story of how Sauron came about and how the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit all happened. Anyone trying to explain what happens in the first stage of the Silmarillion to an audience unfamiliar with how to get through a book like that is going to have enormous troubles. And they definitely didn't do it perfectly. Like, after Galadriel's whole intro talking about the history of the elves and what they're doing in Middle-earth, I definitely came out of that going, okay, there were plenty of proper nouns in there that I did not understand, but it was done well enough so that the points of the plot and the characters that required you to understand that backstory were delivered well. Like the part where Arondir is talking to the humans, he's like, you guys are all descended from Morgoth, and therefore we cannot trust you. It's like, I understood enough about who Morgoth was from that intro to understand why the elves, who are essentially immortal, will still not trust humans. I don't fully understand what Morgoth was doing or what the trees of Valinor were, but that's not really the important part. And so I think, at least for these first couple of episodes, they've definitely gotten a good balance of how much sheer Silmarillion backstory to cover versus how much to just kind of skip over because it's really not necessary to know.
I was just gonna leapfrog on that a little bit. I love seeing, different societies and how they treat each other and their viewpoints. And I would agree with Jonah that that was a really powerful part to me with the elves not trusting the humans because of their very different perspectives. As was said, the elves being immortal, I've literally seen this happen. So to them, it's sort of the same group, whereas for humans, it's wildly different. It's ancestors that they probably have very little, if any, connection to. Obviously, there's the moment where they find the sword hilt and that type of thing, but I enjoyed getting those, moments like that one. And I also enjoy, and this is one reason I love reading multiple POV fantasy, getting to see different perspectives, especially different racial perspectives, getting to see, the elves that are sort of doing kind of the standard thing, if you will, like Galadriel is kind of off doing her own thing, but Elrond feels like living the regular elf life, if you will, versus the like watchtower elves that have a different experience interacting with humans all the time, versus just humans in the town, what their experiences are like, versus the precursors to hobbits. So, if you were to tell me, hey, I've got a bunch of like races in my fantasy world, and we're going to follow kind of like one of each, if you will, I'd be like, yes, sign me up for that. I want to see how each of them are experiencing the world. So I think that was a strong choice to give us insight into each of these groups. That was fun for me.
One of the things that I really appreciate is actually something that I don't think everybody appreciates. I actually saw a post from a friend of mine who said that anybody who enjoys watching The Rings of Power also enjoys drinking recycled bathwater, which I was not expecting, but very evocative. The thing that I like about it, though, is that it's taking its time to set everything up. I know others have accused it of being slow or boring or whatever. I really enjoy a story that takes its time getting where it's going. Well, let me rephrase that. I enjoy an epic fantasy that takes its time setting all of the pieces up properly. And it feels like this story is trying to do that, and I appreciate that.
No, yeah, I think that's fair. One thing, oh, sorry, Jeff, were you going to say something? One thing that if we're going around saying things that we really enjoyed, I'm adding a kind of second one. And it's also a controversial topic, which is the introduction of Galadriel as, I'm going to say her name wrong, it's just going to happen. Galadriel as a warrior, when the character that we meet in Lord of the Rings seems so like calm and pacifist. And some people are like, oh, they're fake girl bossing. They're trying to put a girl, pardon the description, put a girl in a pair of pants, and now all of a sudden she's a feminist. And I was worried about that for the first couple of minutes of the show. I was even like cracking jokes with my brother. But then as the show continued, I started to see some movement and some faith behind character development that could lead her to the Galadriel we know from Lord of the Rings. So instead of just presenting a girl in a pair of pants and going like, this is what a woman is supposed to be. She's strong and fierce, and she just takes on traditionally masculine attributes, and therefore she's a strong woman. What we're seeing is further emotional development that she definitely needs as an imperfect and flawed character to help her get to the point where we see her in Lord of the Rings.
That's
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Jonah, you first.
That's one of the reasons why I love the actual opening to the show so much with Child Galadriel down by the river. Because, like, we have the Galadriel that we can see in this series who is the second age Galadriel. It's warrior Galadriel who fights for what she believes in. And everyone in watching this is coming into this seeing Cate Blanchett's Galadriel, who, by the way, she's one of the few people I simp for. But, like, these are two very different people, but this intro of Child Galadriel, where they literally had her do the same walk that Cate Blanchett does, where she just kind of glides along the riverbank, walking down there. It's just like, guys, this Galadriel is in here. She just has a lot of things to go through first. It was just a really nice kind of nod to the audience, basically going, guys, trust us. We know what we're doing. This is the same character. It's just a different aspect that you haven't seen.
Yeah. And it's an aspect that while this is a different take than the traditional one on Galadriel, it is not one that is thematically dissimilar from other takes in Tolkien lore, right? We have seen fiercely devoted elves who are very kind of like war-minded, both in the books, both in the films that have preceded this. And so Galadriel like is not filling an archetype that is brand new to the series, right? And so that is something that I do like about the Rings of Power thus far, is a fair amount of the changes that they do make in the pursuit of being an adaptation that's being released in 2022. They still do make those changes, I think, more often than not. They make changes that are still thematically centered in kind of Tolkien's classic tropes.
I was just gonna jump in
Looking
real
at-
quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just real fast. I do think prequels have some limits associated with them, but I think they offer up an interesting opportunity where we know where a character ends up. So to start with a character in a very different place, it creates a cool promise, assuming that there's, trust behind the creative team there, that, the part of the joy of watching a prequel is getting to see how this character who appears at this prequel point to be very different than the character we know, how do they get there? And so that's, I think that's an opportunity. That, for any writer, if you are doing a prequel, you can take a character and instead of just making them exactly the same in your prequel, make them different as an opportunity to showcase that change. I think that's a pretty cool, story arc to get to have as a writer.
And I think I see enough direct lines between Galadriel as she's presented here and the Kate Blanchett, Peter Jackson, sort of elder mage kind of character. There are enough connections between here and there that it doesn't feel like this person can't possibly be that one. Honestly, if we're talking about that sort of thing, the one that I actually have a little harder time with is Elrond, who seems to be a very different character, and I don't see how those two connect to each other. I'm willing to give the series some rope as far as that one goes and see how that develops, but I don't see the sort of wise leader of Rivendell in the somewhat scheming politician of Elrond that has been presented so far. So I'll be interested to see how that one develops.
To that point, one thing that this is not a good thing that I've seen thus far, but it is the good thing that I feel like a lot of this has set up for, and that I think potentially the Rings of Power could follow through on. Of course, we'll see, right? Plenty of TV shows, even ones as lauded as Game of Thrones, disappoint their viewership. But one thing that I'm excited for here is this feels, as a TV show, like it has some real promise to be pretty tragic, right? The Second Age is not necessarily the happiest, in the sense that, it begins with the end of one war, right? The War of the Rats, and basically leads into a second, the War of the Ring, right? And so one thing that I am really excited, as sadistic as that might be, to see is to see this kind of like optimistic Elrond who's like, sure, there was darkness and we beat it and it won't come back in any meaningful way. I am kind of excited to see this optimistic Elrond be brought to the Hugo Elrond that we will later see, who faces everything with a grim seriousness that defies any smile that has ever existed, right? I think tragedies are less common than frequent in our current era of storytelling, and so there's part of me that hopes for that. So
On that
Yeah.
same note, I'm honestly kind of in awe in how well the writers are balancing the audience who knows Tolkien lore and the audience who doesn't, to make sure that both people get to have a good experience. Because, and like my objects example is, we're talking about mainly episode 1 here, so I'm not going to talk about anything that happens in the other ones, but the dude who falls from the sky at the end. People who know absolutely nothing about Tolkien lore are just going, okay, who the heck is this dude who just fell from a comet into the middle of these weird short people? And then people like me who don't know all of Tolkien lore but know enough about the Maiar and one specific Mire of Air and Fire to go, oh my gosh, I think I know who that is. And now I'm excited too, because I have theories that I can get excited about. Well, all the other people who don't know still get excited because this was a really flashy way to end the first episode. So I think they're getting a really good balance of hinting at what's going to happen for the people who know enough to get the hint, and yet also being able to keep tension and plot twists open for people who just have no idea and are new to the series. And I think that's honestly a pretty difficult thing to do. So I'm very appreciative of that.
Yeah. And then, oh, go ahead, Cameron.
I was just going to say really quickly, I know it's sort of table stakes for these big fantasy shows at this point, but the visuals in this series are knocking my socks off, even in comparison to some of the others. I think of the Wheel of Time series that came out recently, and this is head and shoulders, visually speaking, above what we got there.
We get a nice sky shot of Numenor later on. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I'm enjoying that. It's not necessarily a writerly what they did right, but boy, they did that right.
Yeah, and to wrap up the conversation, kind of to tie together some of the more recent comments we've heard, they've walked a very interesting line in Rings of Power, where they've pulled some older characters and then they've added, for lack of a better term, OCs. They've added plots that are not directly in the Silmarillion. And I find something, because we're being positive, I find a lot of good things behind that. It's still by creating new plots in a familiar world and trying to respect that familiar world, we're seeing opportunities to surprise the audience. We're seeing new and interesting characters, and we have the ability to get invested in individuals' lives, such as the elf and the lady friend that we see in the first episode, allowing us as the audience a level of empathy that we wouldn't get if we were just reading the Silmarillion side by side, seeing if it was checking all the boxes of the original. I don't know if anyone has any comments about that.
Not that directly, but I am not as familiar with the Silmarillion. I've read some of it, but in some ways, I also went to read what George R. R. Martin put together. That's his newest series is based on as well. And those do tend to feel just a little drier to me, the histories. So I can see what you mean, that the fact we're getting it fleshed out in a living, breathing person, and plus side stories would be more engaging than it could otherwise potentially be. Not, of course, anything against the originals in either case. I was just going to say two other quick writing things that I liked. One was the slow burn of sort of evil, the cow dispelling like blackish oil instead of milk. I thought was just we were just talking about visuals, so it kind of like came to mind. Not necessarily maybe a high-end effect, but one that really worked for me. I was like, that is a way to show me something is wrong in this world. So I like that we don't quite know what the evil is, and not. And again, I'm not saying anything bad here, but I thought the sort of leaf in comparison and like the veins of darkness was a little more over the top to me, like a little more obvious in this place that should be sacred. So I'm just only using that as a point of comparison, that I thought what was done with the cow was like a really interesting, something I hadn't seen, kind of subtle way to indicate, well, it's subtle, but not so subtle way, right? To indicate that there's an evil lurking around there. And then also, because we were talking a lot about Galadriel and sort of her transformation, I thought they devised a very interesting and character moment for her, where she has this opportunity to have bliss and turns away from it. And just in terms of sort of if you were presenting, of course, your thoughts or what you were going to do for your story, your character, like, okay, so there's all these people, they're about to have bliss. She decides no, she's out of there, right? Like that's a really compelling moment and choice to make in your story. So I just wanted to quickly toss those out there as we're wrapping things up.
Oh yeah, and I'll be the one to say it, and I'm sorry if anyone's offended and unsubscribed to us. I have never heard anyone say that they enjoy the Silmarillion. Like the reading, the reading process of it, it's very encyclopedic, and there's aspects of stories that can be pulled. I think I remember actually Amazon talking about pulling from a love story in the Silmarillion and trying to adapt that, and then they stepped away from it. So, no, I agree that the visuals are absolutely stunning. Oh, sorry, Cameron.
Forgive me
did
if
you have
I'm
something?
mistaken about this, but I seem to remember reading some discussion that they don't actually have the rights to the Silmarillion. They actually only have the rights to the appendices from Lord of the Rings, which they paid $250 million for, which goes to show, I mean, why we're maybe not seeing a ton of stuff from the Silmarillion. And I honestly, that constraint, I'm not bothered by it. It allows us to get some of these fresh stories that can fit into the greater Maloo without having to fight against canon.
No, yeah, I absolutely love that. Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say it's just wild the amount of money that was paid for the appendices. Like that's just right as a writer, just writing something that's that amazing, that universally loved that the appendices are. It's just anyway, just a little mind blowing.
To any Hollywood producers out there, I am happy to write some appendices if you've got 250 mil to throw my way. I just throwing that out there.
He's so gracious the way he volunteers these things. It's
I serve the people.
truly.
Yeah. I want to go for less than 500 million, but I mean, I guess that just shows the competitiveness of the market.
I'll do it for
But
a
yeah.
million.
Going there, I think that we're okay to cut off. I will say that a lot of us being positive in this episode also have opinions about how the shows come about, as well as some things in the show that aren't necessarily working for us. So if you guys want to see a video about that and have us talk further about all of the particularly financial controversy and some review editing that's been done, please let us know in the comments. But thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you later, Blockheads.